Well, these probably are the two most important Stearman in my life, because this is the first one I ever flew in all those years ago, and the one behind me is the first one I ever rebuilt.
For the entire century since man first took to the air, the armies and the air forces of the world have exploited the space above them to take their military ambitions into a new dimension. However, when the guns have fallen silent, the engineering and craftsmanship, the skills and knowledge poured into developing these incredible fighting aircraft are frequently cast aside and lost to history. But now we can take you behind locked hangar doors into the secretive world of both the dedicated enthusiasts and big-budget professionals who are spending millions of pounds and thousands of man-hours bringing them back to life. We'll follow 6 forgotten aircraft from rusting wrecks to living, breathing memorials to those who fought and died for their country. These immaculate rebuilds are often against all odds in an impenetrable world of rare finds, intrigue and ingenuity. The research and return to flight of these important aircraft mean these are far from just restorations. These are plane resurrections. In hangars hidden away in rural England, just a stone's throw from one of the largest Second World War USA AF bases, there's a tiny band of professionals who have spent 30 years restoring a string of quintessentially American biplanes to flying condition.
Well, my background was that as a kid I was an avid aeroplane spotter and photographer. So photography was sort of beginning to eat into my life, and I became a professional photographer and ended up flying in all kinds of different sorts of aeroplanes, as we do, flying around the world and whatever. And I went to an air show in Florida in 1900 and frozen to death, and 2 of these taxied by with 2 long-haired hippies flying them, no helmets, in the heat of the Florida sunshine, looked gorgeous, and I thought, what are they? Months later when I got home, a guy started rebuilding these in a nearby airfield at Old Buckingham, and I thought, well, I must go and have a look and take some pictures. Next thing, I was offered a ride in it. Well, smitten I was, and it's just an unbelievable experience with your head in the clouds and flying around in this noisy old radial engine, but beautiful. And at some point I thought, well, I'd really like to own one of those, but it's an impossibility. They're hugely expensive, or seem to be at the time, and they still are. But later, the same guy offered me a project one of these, which was just a pile of bits of broken aeroplane and whatever. And I thought, well, I've been rebuilding motor cars, it can't be that much different, can it? So I ended up buying this project, which took me about a year to just go through the nuts and bolts and brackets and whatever to see whether I got all the parts available, going through pages of maintenance manuals and parts books and all that kind of stuff. And eventually I thought, well, I think it's a go. And I got a wing kit from America, which was all the wood you could need to build the wings. All the ribs are made, the spars are made, and I needed someone to glue that together. Happened to have come across a guy that flies from this airfield who was a wood specialist for aeroplanes. So I just threw the whole lot at him and said, build me the wings, which he did. And then, of course, fabricing, you've got to do all that. Never done any of that before. So you got miles and miles of fabric and glue and dopes and all this kind of stuff. And eventually it sort of started to come together.
So Paul had achieved his dream. Little did he know, events now would shape his whole life ahead.
The P.T. Stearman primary trainer was a rugged biplane. Wooden wings, tubular steel fuselage.
These aeroplanes flew millions of hours in America training our guys to fly the Second World War fighters, bombers, whatever kind of aeroplanes, both for the Navy, both for the American Air Force, and the British Air for the RAF. RAF guys used to go to the States and train on these things. So they've got a history offshore more than in the UK, because there were none here during the Second World War, but the guys that flew here in the Second World War have probably all flown Stearman.
Well, before America entered the war, discussions had taken place with the British, and the British were invited to set up training airfields in America, run by American civilian companies. One of the great advantages out there was the sheer size of America. Its vast spaces allowed aerodromes to be established where pilots could learn and train with wide open areas, more space to crash in, some might have said, but at least they would fly in peace. You didn't have the risk of intruding aircraft shooting you down as you learned to stumble about the heavens. Over there, California, the Midwestern states, plenty of good weather, not like England. And the American people welcomed the young cadets from Great Britain. They took them to their hearts very much indeed, and memories became fond between the two countries. It helped set the situation for the future as RAF airmen trained over there.
Most of the Stearman produced for the training role were painted blue and yellow, bright colours, so they could be seen in the air, because training fields in America might have had 50 or 60 aeroplanes in the air at a time, so they wanted to be very visible. But towards the end of the war, that they were cracking up so many of these Stearmans in training, maybe up to 10 were wrecked a day on some of these training fields, that it became a nightmare for them to keep the blue and yellow paint jobs going, because they'd replace a wing off a bent aeroplane and it would come back doped silver, as all aeroplanes have to be painted with silver dope. So what happened was you ended up with aeroplanes flying around with yellow wings, rudder maybe silver, and it was beginning to get a bit of a mess. So it was decided towards the end, leave them silver, paint them silver.
One of the unsung and yet highly unlikely technical heroes of the training process was the link trainer. Looking more like a fairground ride than an aircraft, this air-powered contraption gave a surprisingly accurate ground-based simulation for the novice pilot, and was so successful it entered use worldwide, training thousands of potential pilots, including those destined for combat with the US and British Air Forces.
The link trainer explains how the controls are operated and what effect their movements have upon a plane in the air. In the link trainer, preliminary instruction in instrument flying is given. The student practices straight and level flying, normal turns, climbing and gliding turns, stalls and spins, and flying a course on the radio beam.
What got me interested in aeroplanes is when I was at school we had 3 or 4 link trainers, rather like the one that behind. They were great fun because you know, for a kid you moved it and it rocked and rolled and everything like that. They're quite realistic. The great joy about it, as opposed to one of these modern simulators, is that when you pull the stick back, the aeroplane moved, and when you kick the rudder, it span. And not only that, if it was connected to a proper console, you could take off from a particular place and you could fly, and the console would draw a line on a map where you'd been. And when you'd finished, the teacher would give you this and say, "Well done, Gibbons, you've done this, that and the other." When I was at school, I was at Cheltenham College, I got a flying scholarship. And I went down to a place called Thruxton, and that's where I first flew a Tiger Moth, DH-82A, which was rather fun. And then I did my national service, and as I was still interested in aeroplanes, and I was reasonably bright then, they got me to go to Canada where I was learned to fly, and I was sent out to the province of Alberta, where I learned on piston schools, which is where I learned to fly on a thing called a Harvard. And then when I passed out of that, I then went to Manitoba, which is one of the middle states, and there at a place called Portage de la Prairie, I was put on jet school, flying an aeroplane called a T-33, or a Silver Star, which is based on the F-80 fighter. I thoroughly enjoyed my time there, you know, it was really superb. And then after that I came back, and while I was at university I was in the Auxiliary Air Force. I did physics at Cambridge University, that's why I'm such a boring old fart. And then after all that, you know, I left the Air Force in 1960 and went out to the Far East, and there I worked for about 25 years.
A decade before James first took to the controls, RAF pilots were also finding their wings thanks to the Tiger Moth, as they prepared to meet the Axis powers in the air. The Moth was a great flying start and easy to control, but the leap to faster and heavier aircraft wasn't easy. The Stearman, whilst also a biplane, was far larger, heavier and altogether more robust than its English counterpart, and softened the leap to the less forgiving monoplane fast trainers like the Harvard.
It was said of the Stearman that there was nothing really that the Stearman couldn't teach the novice pilot, and that was exactly what it was designed to do. To become a pilot, you have the enthusiasm, and of course they did, but you needed then to pass a medical. During the Second World War, the Allies designed various tests and procedures that you would have to undertake before you would become an aviation cadet and would go to one of the many flying schools where you would find something called the barony chair. They'd put you in the chair and spin you around and then stop it suddenly, and you'd have to get up and they would see how coordinated or otherwise you might be. That was important, along with a whole series of other tests that they devised. After you'd volunteered to fly, you needed to be taken through the military procedures, and that fundamentally would be, after your tests and examinations, away you would go to boot school, where you would learn to march in the military manner. You would have to learn radio, aircraft recognition, mathematics, some of the sciences, a bit about the engines, navigation, all the fundamental stuff, as well as the military, weeks and weeks before you were allowed.
Norfolk. For a while in World War II, the home of the 93rd Bomb Group, and later a naval base despite being 15 miles from the coast. Now the home to a dedicated band of volunteers, keeping a packed museum running, honouring pilots and crew from the birth of flight through to the Cold War. Their challenge now is the biggest they've ever faced, not just preserving a donated aircraft, but building their Stearman from scratch to pristine, and to the casual observer, flight-ready condition. There's no shortage of skilled help, but despite this, it's a massive job, and they're facing all the same challenges as any builder of fabric-covered airframes.
They would have put dope on the fabric, which we haven't done, because the fabric is just taut by heat gun, and we're hoping that that's going to work well. It's worked on the fuselage and the other parts, and it seems to produce a good result, but a lot easier than applying dope. Well, it's standard RAF trainer yellow. I mean, that was the thing they did, and it's obvious that you can see it well. And in the case of the Stearman, I think they had another name, which was the Yellow Peril, because of some of its handling characteristics. But yellow is a standard RAF trainer colour. Having said that, of course, the new Hawks are black, but mostly they were yellow in these days.
While I was talking to some old boys in the States who worked on training airfields, one said to me it was not unusual to have 10 Stearman a day wrecked, and you think, my goodness. But of course they had masses of spare parts. They were very simple airframes. If you bent a wing, you'd take it off and put another one on and wrap it all up, and be back on the line the next morning. Putting the fabric on normally takes a bit of time, but if you were operating in the Second World War training airfield, they would probably have spare wings ready to swap while somebody repaired the old one. So the turnaround from these silly little accidents that many people had was probably quite rapid. As far as the fabric goes these days, I mean, in the past it was linen or cotton, and we now use a man-made fibre, and we use a fabric called seconite, where once you glued it down and you then shrink it with an iron, so you get that nice tension into it, and then we dope over the top of that, which gives it a little bit more bing to it. When you knit it with your finger, you get this nice ringing sound. Historically, with the cotton or linen, which cotton in America's probably the most common. You had to put a dope on it, which, as the dope dries, it shrinks and stretches the fabric, and that is quite time consuming. But I guess in the war they had big brushes and massed dope and whacked it on at a phenomenal rate.
The fabric covering the aircraft wasn't the only Stearman feature that harked back to the beginnings of flight. The aircraft has traditional open cockpits, exposed to the wind and the weather, as well-known Warbird owner Maurice Hammond found out when he acquired his ex-US Navy example.
It was on I think it was 1st of March. There was frost in the corners of the field. OAT was about sort of +2. And I'd never flown a Stearman before, so a good friend of mine came with me. We flew down in a nice and warm Arrow and got out of the cockpit, and my friend who was going to actually fly the airplane, I was going to navigate and sit in the front seat, had got light ski trousers, ski mask, 3 coats, gloves, mittens, and I'd got my A2 jacket, flying suit, and boned up with me. And he said, you haven't flown much open cockpit really, have you? I said, well, no, not really. He said, yeah, I'm a bit worried about that, but we'll see how we go. And really from Land's End to Compton Abbas was really, the chill was unbelievable really. I don't think I've ever been so cold in all my life when we got out at Compton Abbas. So I felt as if my fingers would snap. So the line that I was putting on the chart, which I'd got in the front, only went halfway. And I'm sure the chronograph froze up, so but that was an interesting flight back.
Stearman being as big as they are, after the war, when they didn't need fleets and fleets and fleets of trained pilots for the conflict, Stearman became ideal aeroplanes to convert to crop dusting. They removed the small engine, which is only 220 horsepower on the standard aeroplane, put a 450 horsepower engine on the front of it, take the front seat out, put a huge hopper in there with 1,000 pounds of chemicals in it, replacing the 200-pound pilot. So they needed a bigger engine to get the aeroplane in the air. And they converted something like 4,500 Stearman into crop dusters. Well, of course, it's an ancient aeroplane, and technology takes over. They designed and built modern crop dusting aeroplanes especially for the job. So the Stearmans ended up being sort of thrown in barns and left, and there's lots lying around in America. They are, even to this day, Stearmans stuffed in barns which people have never done anything with. But as of the late 60s, all these historic aeroplanes, people were beginning to think, well, there's some value in them. It's a bit like classic cars in a way. And these old crop dusters are being dragged out of warehouses and workshops and barns and all over the place, and people restoring them back to what they once were. And this is where this one comes in. You know, this was a crop duster. And it was also my demise in this thing, because this is the very first Stearman I ever flew in. So the beginning of all my problems is standing behind me all these years later.
In the post-war years, the demand for farm produce rocketed in the USA as rationing came to an end in Europe. So the crop duster came into its own, delivering its load of fertilizer or insecticide across acres at a single pass. The availability of cheap, reliable aircraft and the pilots trained to fly them meant that aerial top dressing became a booming industry. This might have been good for the farmers, but it took a fearsome toll on the pilots. The requirement to fly low and to get the job done as quickly as possible meant that accidents inevitably happened. They could be found doing what would now be seen as madness, flying beneath power cables, through openings in wooded land, and within inches of the crops they targeted, with little or no direct forward vision. Many, having survived one, perhaps 2 world wars, died in fiery crashes alongside the very fields that provided their livelihood. Unsung heroes of post-war aviation.
The most incredible reaction we've ever had here was one guy that I used to go to school with, who went to the States as a young lad and learned to fly and ended up running one of the biggest crop dusting companies in the country, in America. he returned to see his family, wandered in here because he knew we got Stearman, saw that on the wall and said, "My God, that's my best mate. I rang him 2 days before I left from America." So he was quite surprised to find that his buddy's aeroplane had sort of drifted across the Atlantic and landed in our workshop. I think the appeal of a Stearman is global. And since the crop dusting days are over and they've been restoring them in America and people have been visiting from the UK have got fallen in love with seeing these things at air shows or wherever. And of course it was nice to think, well, I'd like one of those and import one, and that's been going on, and now they're imported they're all over the world now, and Europe has got masses of them. But they're such an iconic aeroplane and so simple to fly and kind of, in my eyes, quite beautiful. Well, if you want a bit of romance in flying, it's nice to have something like a Stearman, historic, affordable in most cases, because they don't like other warbirds. If you're going to buy a Mustang or something, you've got to think about a gallon a minute of fuel. These will burn 10 gallons an hour, and you can have a hell of a lot of fun. They're fully aerobatic if you like that kind of thing, and just great touring aeroplanes as well.
Paul's warbird-owning colleague Maurice Hammond added a Stearman to his American collection to make a set. The multi-million-pound 400 mph Mustang fighter, the big, bold Harvard intermediate trainer, and the altogether more modest Stearman Cadet entry-level biplane, on which the pilots of the bigger birds would have literally earned their wings. So Maurice knows the mechanics of the biplane very well.
Yeah, the crop dusters, everybody put 450 Pratt & Whitneys in them to lift the weight and to have the power to do the crop spraying. It's virtually just a scaled down version of the Harvard engine, which is the Wasp. Yes, 2.5 hours to empty on fuel, uses about a gallon of oil an hour, and a radial engine. And yeah, it's just great. It's twice the amount of horsepower the airplane was designed to have initially, so it doesn't go any faster, it just gives up a lot of lift. But yeah, they are heavy. The nose is shortened, so it gives to make the center of gravity come right. So yeah, it's just a heavy airplane. The one I have, went to Singapore in '56, and the engine was installed, and the airframe's never been cut. So we are confident that it never became a duster. There's nothing in the airframe to indicate. Normally, to put the hopper in, you have to remove the front seat, and therefore you have to cut the airframe. But the airframe's just completely standard. So,
most people, when they build an aeroplane for the first time, build something kind of small or sort of whatever, buy yourself a kit or something. This was a bit beyond that, and you need quite a lot of space. Well, as it happened, when I started to rebuild this, I'd built an extension on the house, which never quite got finished, and I thought that would make a wonderful workshop to rebuild the aeroplane in. Not the fuselage, but when I was rebuilding the wings, I had all the wings in there, did all the doping, stitching, fabric work, and spraying. If anybody lifts the carpet, you'll see all this silver dope on the floor where I knocked over the cans of paint, but it lent itself because it was centrally heated. Wonderful.
Back at Flixton Air Museum, the volunteers are making slow but good progress on the assembly of their Stearman example. Originally, the aircraft were assembled back-to-back on a massive production line. But despite substantial amounts of metalwork in the fuselage, the work was still carried out by human welders, long before the advent of computer-controlled construction. For that reason, each example of the aircraft can have a degree of difference or tolerance in its fit. The team at Flixton find this to be very much the case when it comes to assembling the tie wires that add strength to the wing assemblies. There are 4 of these assemblies on each side, port and starboard. Despite the name wires, these are in fact long extruded strips of stainless steel, profiled to reduce drag and threaded in opposing directions at each end. Thus, when, as the museum restorers found, the wires are a little on the long side, it's not a simple matter of snipping off the excess. The strips have to be ground down, reprofiled and deburred to to fit the original brackets before the wing assembly can be made taut. It's not an easy job. The wires are specially hardened to preserve their life on the aircraft and to resist the very process that the team are attempting. Without the guy wires, the wings will be flimsy and sag at the very least. Plus, the volunteers are determined that whilst never destined to fly, their Stearman will be built to the same exacting production standards as the original, wherever possible. Finally, the task is completed, and the wires are offered up to fit the wing assembly. It's taken hours of work for the team and has brought with it a realization of the problems faced by the engineers in the field all those years ago.
Yes, definitely.
Putting a Stearman together needs a bit of manpower, and you need lots of people to be balancing here and there on various sort of step ladders and whatever to get the wings all the way up there and support them. And it's kind of a learning curve, but we got better at it as the years went by. It always seems to be that when you put one of these together and you do your first test flight, there's little tweaks you have to do here and there. The cables that hold the wings and put all the tension into the whole airframe need tweaking this way and that way, or else it might fly wing down, wing up a little bit. But you spend a couple of weeks sort of working all the finesses in and out of it, you know.
Post-war, a lot of Stearmans found their way into other nations. Some 20+ countries used adaptations of the Stearman. Some of them used them for military purposes, apparently occasionally in the counterinsurgency role or fighting rebels, or indeed being the rebels fighting the government. The Stearman, because of it was a rugged machine and easy to fly, could be adapted to a whole manner of tasks and duties, and many of them were.
A lot of Stearmans, because of their kind of simple things to fly and maintain, were used by Central and South American countries in fairly large numbers. Mexico may even have some flying at the moment. The Canadians had about 300 Stearmans delivered through a military aid package, and that was to train RAF pilots in Canada because they weren't allowed to be trained in America. But things changed a little later on, and the Canadians found that the Stearman was pretty well useless in Canada, because Canada being such a cold country, you know, open cockpit aeroplanes, the pilots and crew froze to death. So a few Canadian Stearmans were fitted with a canopy, which was hopefully going to cure the problem of the crew freezing to death, but ultimately that didn't really work, so they were then sent back to America and did flying training there. Yeah, when the Stearman, when they were in Foreign Air Force use in South America and Central America quite a lot, several of those airframes probably still kick about, but what happened post-war was that South America was one of the big areas that the crop dusting Stearman was used in. And it happens that one of the guys in Norfolk, who was training in America in the Second World War, found languishing in El Salvador as a crop duster a Stearman which he actually flew while he was training. So he brought that back to the UK and was very proud to say, "I flew this in the war, Daddy." And it was quite amazing that he could find the actual aeroplane he flew in. He's now living in Luxembourg.
The wings of the Flixton Stearman are finally in place after much modification of the bracing wires. Now the attention of the museum restorers turned to the tail. A simple assembly, but notoriously difficult to get assembled and bolted to the fuselage without many hands to help. The museum has completed the fabric covering and painted it in the Canadian issue RAF all-yellow colour scheme. This represents the finish that RAF trainees would have expected to see on their aircraft in the training camps of the British Commonwealth during the war. On many simple aircraft, the horizontal tail surfaces are bolted on in turn, but on the Stearman they have a pair of tie bars between them, which, whilst adding strength to the overall structure, mean that the entire assembly has to be handled as a single piece, which isn't proving too easy. New bolts are a tight fit, but with some realignment and a touch of persuasion, they finally slip into place and are tightened to hold the basic structure. Whilst precision torquing isn't needed, the display Stearman must be safe and solid, and now the nightmare of bracing rears its head again. There's a pair of flying wires beneath the horizontal stabilizer assembly that will need to be in place before the control surfaces will support themselves. This time, the steel strips are within tolerance though, the right length, and prove an easier task. It's a time-consuming job building this one-off example, but of course, that wasn't always the way.
This factory is completing its 1,000th plane for the Army. The Stearman Aircraft Company of Wichita, Kansas, is the first to reach the 1,000 mark in the number of warplanes delivered to the military forces. The defense program calls for busy construction, and that's what we see here, mass production of planes. Major Harris of the United States Army congratulates Company Executive J.E. Schaefer and takes delivery of the 1,000th plane. Employees of the company are enthusiastic, and the takeoff with a cheer. There goes the first 1,000th plane delivered to the Army by any aircraft plant.
Back in the modern day, the tail and rudder are ready to be lifted into place. There's no swarm of Stearman Company staff here, so it's just a two-man job. Despite their concerns, the museum volunteers find the tail section is a perfect fit and can be wiggled into place with little trouble, and bolts are slotted in and hand-tightened. Though it will never fly, the team want their plane to have all the operational controls of an airborne example, so care is taken that all the surfaces pivot and move. The fin wears the red, white and blue tail flash that was common to all RAF training aircraft of the period, not to be confused with the French national flag. Once again, tie wires are measured, adjusted, and then offered up to tension and strengthen the assembly at the rear of the aircraft. This time, there's less than half an inch of adjustment needed to get the wartime components in place. Even the fairings that cover the area ahead of the tail fin align without issues. They're special Zeus fasteners locking into place without modification. It's this type of component that is the Achilles heel for the Stearman restorers. Major items, wings, undercarriage, fuselage were expected to be damaged, and huge numbers of spares were created during the service life of the aircraft. However, the less vulnerable covers, panels and clips are uncommon as spares and becoming hard to source as originals and expensive to replicate. The control cables are adjusted to give proper movement limits, and then the final position is fixed with special lock nuts. There's a risk that the vintage rudder control horns may no longer be up to the job, but the cables are locked down for what will surely be their last time without an issue. Rudder movement is checked, just as it would be on the production line. Rudder control was crucial to trainees as they learnt to spin and recover their aircraft in combat. Attaching the Stearman's ailerons is something of a dark art, and it's crucial not to damage the fragile covering. Factory workers were skilled in the task, and Paul Bennett has passed on his special techniques for the job, especially for sliding the awkward securing pins into place. Now the surfaces, complete with authentic trim tabs, are secured to the rear empennage successfully, the pins snapping satisfyingly into place. Ironically, the aircraft, now forever enclosed within the safety of the museum, looks almost ready to take to the air.
No, we've done a lot of Stearman, and I think we've probably all Stearmaned out now. That I'm getting on, and they take a long time to put together, and the problem now is that spare parts are getting difficult to find in certain areas. You can get 90% of the aeroplane, but finding the other 10% is becoming very difficult. Also, parts are now getting very, very expensive, and it becomes a bit of a nonsense because it's going to cost you more to rebuild it than it can end up being worth. You're doing it for the love of it more than anything, and it's to produce one of these and get it in the air and see somebody jump in it and smiling from ear to ear is almost enough in itself for building it. But again, you know, you've got to be sensible about these things, and I don't really want them to cost me money. Keeping these things flying probably won't be a problem once you've got a whole one, because if you have a problem with any part, it can be found. But if you want to start from scratch to rebuild one, you've got to find all the parts, and that becomes difficult. Once they're active, there's no problems with engines at the moment. I can see that these engines are going to be available forever and ever and ever. The airframe is tubes, fabric, the wings are wood ribs, wood spars. You can make all that. The wood's available, it's got to be high quality, you've got to have people knowing what they're doing, putting it together, but I think these things can go on forever. The Flixton aeroplane is looking pretty good. I mean, from a critical eye, you can sort of, like us, you know that it would never be airworthy, but it makes a very good representative of aeroplane of the Stearman. It's painted in what looks like RAF colours because it was based on one which was used by the Canadian Forces to train British pilots and funded through the military aid package, and was issued with RAF type serial numbers and had RAF roundels. We've helped where we can and popped over there and given them a bit of advice here and there, and they're continually coming to us and saying, have you got this bit, have you got that bit? And in most cases we have, but other than that they've had to sort of be a little bit sort of free and easy with the assembly. I think the Flixton aeroplane, for nothing else, has given the guys something to think about, because it's not a simple aeroplane to rig it up. You've got to have kind of hold your wings up in the middle of nowhere for ages and put wires in and go and hold it together. But I think, you know, in a way it's been a training aid for them as well. The Stearman construction is very simple, and it's very simple to put it together really, but of course, like all aeroplanes, it has to be pretty exact here and there, because you can't, you know, have one wing pointing one way and one the other, and you could be in a nasty mess. But I think the guys at Flixton, because they don't intend to fly it, have got away with a little bit, but it looks good. I think they've done a pretty fine job of it. My Stearman was ordered in 1941, probably delivered in 1942, but they've been making Stearman for a year or two before that, and the design goes kind of way back, and it started off in the late 30s, but ended up when the Army Air Corps ordered these, that Boeing had bought out Stearman as a company. When Boeing produced the Stearman for the services, they made them in several different models, and the biggest difference mostly was the engines. So some had Lycoming made engines, these are Continental engines. There was another one called a Jacob, so they got different numbers for the airframes, and this is an N2S3 naval aeroplane N2S3. That was the type. They had N2S1s, 2s, 3s and 4s and 5s, which is confusing. Then in the Army, they call them PT-27s. Well, an N2S3 and a PT-27, identical aeroplanes, but one was Navy, one was Army Air Force.
Paul has had dozens of examples of the aircraft pass through his hands over the years, and along with his restoration partner Bob, they are now ready to test the most recent example.
Well, this is the latest Stearman rebuilt. It's got all the paperwork signed, ready to roll. It's had an engine run or two. A test flight is always the most nerve-wracking thing you could ever experience. You've gone through every nut and bolt, every split pin, all the paperwork, engines, everything you could think of, time and time again. Other people have checked your work, so it's doubly checked. but the first flight to me always gives me butterflies. Restoring this aeroplane wasn't the most difficult one because when we got it, it was a complete machine. What we had to do was refabricate it, go through all the woodwork on the wings, nice, bright, shiny, zero-timed engine. It's only done about 5 hours ground run testing, but as good as the day they built it 70 years ago. When you finally hand an aeroplane over to its new owner, you sometimes feel a bit sort of sad because you've kind of sort of lost the baby, so to speak. Because there's a lot of excitement from the customer point of view when they're here and they see it being built, all the processes. And you feel kind of buoyed up by the fact that they're so excited about the thing being put together. And when we've test flown it and the new owner comes along and he's got, either he flies it or somebody he knows will fly it away from here, that gives me another nervous moment because how much time have they got on Stearmans or tail dragger aeroplanes, and it's their aeroplane, so it's up to them what they do with it. But it's always worrying that the guy might not have enough experience, but so far, touch wood, we've never had any incidents.
Paul hopes to keep his incident record clear as the doors roll open on a chilly morning. The aircraft was topped up and engine tested the previous day, so today it's final pre-flights, handover to the ground crew, and that nerve-tingling moment as the throttle is pushed forward to take a 70-year-old aircraft into the sky, just as it would have been on the first day that it rolled off the factory floor. It's a familiar scene to Paul and Bob, but for a new owner, it's a moment to treasure. Test pilot Mike goes through his checklist. Fuel, pressures, electrical, wind conditions, emergency procedures are all cross-checked before the familiar bark of the 7-cylinder engine cuts the air.
Well, that Stearman used to fly many years ago when I took my first flight in it. But sadly, shortly after that it was grounded because it had a few problems, and the owner thought, well, it would be fun to take it all to pieces and rebuild it. 13 years on, sadly he died with nothing happening to the aeroplane, so it became available for purchase, and we had somebody who was very interested in having a Stearman, so he did the negotiations with the widow and we restored it, and now it's as beautiful as it ever was, and it's wonderful to see it back in the air. It's a sort of gut-wrenching sort of thing when you see them in the air. After all the hard labour you've put into restoring these, 70-year-old aeroplanes. But to see these old aeroplanes flying is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And to think that you've actually built or rebuilt them, and we've rebuilt several now, and it's a joy every time they take to the sky. The owner